who writes on a regular basis for Flash Art, Art Monthly, Portfolio, Camera Austria, and many others. He's written numerous catalogue essays for, amongst others, Gillian Waring, Jemima Stelly, David Shrigley, and Michael Landy. I'd like to welcome him to the podium.
Wishing all the women in the room happy International Women's Day. Remind men next year on March the 3rd, you might do the same. Depends which one. It's the 8th. I thought it was the 3rd. Well, that's it. I wrecked my grades. All the women initially immediately put down ones. The title of my talk today is meant to refer directly to an essay by Alan Sekula, which was first written in 1976, but then went through permutations and adaptations. So it was largely finished in the form that most of us have read it in 78. But it too is 30 years old, or close to that 35-year moment, which provides a kind of point of return, which is one of the reasons why initially I wanted to use it to bounce off of in my paper. But I enacted a horrific kind of inversion of the original title. Originally it was Dismantling Modernism, Reinventing Documentary, Notes in the Politics of Representation. And by changing the title, what I wanted to try and do was to put our moment into some sort of context, our moment of culture, stroke, economy. Now that paper's gone through a number of different permutations, my own. And today what I really would like to do is take something of the paper, but take something of the notes that I've jotted down as I've sat in this room today, to try and contextualize a little bit some of what I'm hearing and receiving throughout today. The title and project, which was in Sekula's essay, was left largely unfinished. Unfinished in as much as modernism has not been dismantled. If anything, one of the characteristics which confuses or even interests theorists today is the persistence of modernism. We've heard an awful lot about modernism today, at least as a kind of subtext of the things that people are saying, which is very interesting as much as the title of the conference has this wonderful kind of postmodern kind of epigraph, fictions abound, which they do. But some of the fictions which Sekula attempted to attack in the essay were those kind of structuring fictions, or fictions which structured, in a sense, the medium of photography, and particularly documentary practices. And those fictions, in a sense, have gone nowhere, and in fact may be part of the structure of the practice, or what could be referred to as a structured structure. So a set of ideas or concepts or even dispositions which both produce and reproduce the medium, but also those practitioners which enter into it. And it affects all of us, me, you, whatever. And some of those myths or kind of fictions are centered around exactly truth and the constructed or staged or fake. And it's that doubly coded aspect of photography, which I think is an interesting area for this conference to dig out, but also as it's asserted itself through the talks today. Doubly coded in as much as whenever we look at an image, we always already imagine it as both obviously true, but at the same time obviously false. It's a sample, a selection, radically removed from the world in which it finds itself. The other quote, which kind of offered itself very early on when I started to think this presentation some months ago, was a statement from Doug Hubler, which he used to, in a sense, enter into photographic would-be documentary practice within conceptual art. And that is, the world is more or less already full of objects I have no intention to add to them. And what struck me as a challenge, which we all might think, as far as documentary or photographic practice today, is how might that relate to our own practices, in as much as the world is already more or less full of images. Why or how are we going to go about adding to them in a moral, political, ecological way? Now, what I wanted to kind of think through aloud in the presentation was, in a sense, the status of the image and the status of the medium, which is coming out of today. I've been really taken by this notion of looking at the world, or looking at constructions and photographing constructions, or looking at social processes, the Lee River, or what have you, already as an image, so that the world almost comes forward already as an image. And I was struck by a statement David made as far as a lot of these practices, documentary practices, which we would have related to in the past, circulating the world through magazines or newspapers, what have you, now come forward, or a selection of those practices come forward only as art. And I immediately began to think how that related exactly to some of the things I'm going to say today about culture and economy and image and control, attempting to control these processes through image. One of the notions which, in my mind, keeps postmodernism on the table when we stop relating to it as how a hairstyle, or how one might wear their pants, or even sampling or fictions around it, is the relation of culture and economy, and not in a kind of modernist frame that the economy has imposed itself on a would-be autonomous realm of culture or art, but that culture has expanded, in a sense, to touch on every particular field, which may in the past may have had some degree of autonomy, a field being something which defines itself by what it excludes. Now, I would challenge all of us to try and look and try and find a place, a space in our moment that is not once already made visible, but also already relates to culture, or doesn't relate to culture in some way. So, this notion of the world already presented as image, or served up as image, ready to be simply photographed in a way in which it kind of strikes me a similar kind of response that you had out of an aspect of conceptualism. There were some people who worked in and around conceptualism who were interested in photography, particularly because they found it a very troubling, complicated medium. It took up representation, which was the imaginary capture of a subject, intervine object. And there were others who simply thought, well, this is a pretty straightforward, dumb recording device. I don't have to become very involved. I can simply point the camera and click, and it will do all the rest. And when the world is already presented as image, when culture expands and becomes, in a sense, coterminous with economy, when we feel as if we lack control in almost every aspect of our relations exactly with that world as image, the control that we can enact once again through some act of photography, sampling a fragment of a space which is already fragmented, and isolating it. It strikes me as part of the notion of control, which I think is played out in a lot of the practice, a lot of the photographic practices we've seen today, relates directly in my mind to that status of at once both the world as image and a world in which everything is made, in a sense, visible. At the same time, I'm kind of interested in the contradiction between the lack or the degree of control which is attempted through photographic practices today in our moment, and at the same time the kind of willful aiming for ambiguity, right? For a notion that what makes for a strong image might be this ambiguous status, or an indeterminate meaning. Now all of these things suggest to me that the very, very strong notions of modernism within the practices that we're relating today, the practices that we're all involved in, are still in circulation. Because largely what we've been talking about today has not been the construction of meaning or deconstructing meaning. We're looking at how meaning might be built or how a photograph means. We've been looking largely at the kind of formal qualities of an image, flatness, texture, depth. And so at once we can have a work that can be ambiguous enough to relate to practices of painting, relate to practices of performance, relate to straight photography, relate to constructive photography, all at the same time. Now that degree of ambiguity raises necessarily the art coefficient of the work. It becomes more attractive to circulate in the world in an art context or a gallery context. And that, for me, returns me to a notion of intentions. Not the intentions or meaning which might be underneath that photograph when you lift it up, or some sort of reconstituted state of mind that the practitioner had when they were making the work. But how someone decides their work may go out into the world and circulate within the world. So exactly how they're shaping the product of their labor and how they relate to their labor as also a product. To return, in a sense, to both Doug Kugler's statement and also the kind of schematic set up through Jeff Wall's practice of documentary photograph and a photograph which is drawn from cinematography or working in a cinematographic manner. One of the things that struck me is that it is exactly in Wall's practice where you can find some relationship to denial or denying or an image coming out of the denial to make an image. And what, for me, in my mind, what structures that dichotomy in Wall is exactly the fact that in a photograph which he is staged or constructed along the lines of cinematography, he has at some time actively chosen not to make that photograph in the past, but to deny the photographic act, if only to set it aside, come back to, and work through as along the lines of cinematography. With the documentary photograph, there's no active denial. There's kind of willful making of the picture. Even now, couched within a kind of a phrase coming from Wall along the lines of, it struck me as a photograph immediately. Which struck me as an incredibly odd thing for Jeff Wall to say, at least in my kind of reading and reception of his work. The notion that a photograph might strike him as a picture immediately and made it in style. But in a way that Wall's practice and Wall's kind of statement, although it's still lodged in this act of denial, which says something about the construction, thinking through how a photograph is constructed along lines of meaning. A practice is shifting in line with both the contemporary status of the photographic image and also the status of the medium in the wider culture, which in my mind is both the power and also the weakness of photography, in that the status of the medium and the status of the image today has everything to do, in my mind, with this expansive notion of culture, of everything being made visible, everything being offered up, in a sense, for consumption. So the cultural and the economic kind of merging in a sense. But at the same time, my mind is turned to how might we return to that kind of critical moment, or the notion of this wedge, which was attempted to be driven into documentary practices tied to modernism in order to reinvent them, to take them out of a purely modernist, formalist, expressive realm, or take a documentary practice out of a kind of mystifying act of implication in the system and make it a critical practice which could say something about the actual existing relations in the world, but at least wasn't part of the problem. And I'm not certain exactly how we might get there at the present moment. But the only thing that comes forward to me as an answer is, in effect, part of the answer to David's left rhetorical question of what is the difference between 8, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And that is returning to a notion of a photographic practice which isn't lodged in the singular image, which bears some relation to an extended kind of series, extended montage, or maybe even simply a series, which can be structured and added to something like a series that is sequenced, that then can build some sort of consequence out of that flow. But in order to do any of these things, we have to, in a way, return back to questions of photographic meaning. How does a photograph mean? How does it work? And I think an awful lot of thought and theory that comes out of the 70s has been taken on board. But part of what worries me is when things are taken on board, they're also oftentimes taken for granted and easily forgotten. And as a writer and a critic, I'm at once interested in practices which kind of surf through that wave of ambiguity, because they leave an awful lot up to me to kind of write the image, to narrate the image, to speak, in a sense, for the image. But that at the same time runs against my notion of my own practice, of not realizing that I'm going to insert myself between the artist's practice and the work by necessity, but at the same time wanting to focus on their practice, and that being the way how my practice is shaped and structured. But those are things which we might return to in discussion. Along the lines of the status of the image and the function of the image in culture today, I was struck, in a sense, by the kind of image of terror or fear or simulated violence, which is played out in an awful lot of work at the moment. And a quote from Regis Debray came to mind, which is, "If you want to make yourself known everywhere and establish dominion over the world, manufacture images instead of writing books. This is the moral of the story which all empires have known, from the Byzantine to the American." There's a line in an essay, another essay that Alan Sekula wrote, which he finished in August of 2001, which was published in October, the journal October, in which he doesn't entirely finish the thought, but he begins to put this idea that whoever controls images has power over fear and terror, exactly through the images. And I'm wondering exactly how these images of simulated kind of terror, simulated violence, relate to attempts to control an image, but also at the same time control aspects of fear and terror. And in kind of trying to think that through, we might also return to a very early moment in kind of photographic theory and ask ourselves if exactly a photograph of those spaces of simulated violence, if they can tell us, if that photograph can tell us anything about the system which produces that violence, or the actual violence which is being practiced or rehearsed in those scenes. And so once again, it leaves me thinking that these images are fundamentally mute and silent, and given their incredible descriptive potential or possibility, they fundamentally have to operate as discursive kind of activities. So they need more brought to them, or they need more of them, whether it's supplied by the practitioner or whether it returns back to a notion of an image text bond, something that rescues an image from simply surfing a kind of wave of ambiguity, but at the same time realizes or acknowledges the kind of modernist traps of simply relying on a formal or formalist kind of context in which to place one's work, place the stakes of one's work as well. Parody is another element that I wanted to explore, which comes out of the title. I don't want to deconstruct the title because David did a very nice job of that earlier today. But I wanted to think, in a way, through what parody, or what are some of the functions of parody, and how might parody be working, both within the title, but within practices. And I very much relate to parody as a kind of sampling of a code, which is then used in order to send it back to its original source. And I'm wondering if these kind of parodic acts of either violence or simulated terror or images which relate to the world as already presented as image, how they might be both reflecting on not only the status of the image, the status of the medium, but also the status of the practice as far as a documentary practice. And what is the space, in a sense, for it to exist now, if there might be any other offered other than the gallery. Or if that is simply the best means to kind of achieve kind of status or position. This image, some of you may be familiar with it, but it is the wall outside the classroom where Alan School was teaching. It's simply a kind of schematic which he may have used in the class, kind of scribbled along the door sides from one end of the class. For lessons on photography for the Petty Control C. Now part of my inability in a way to stick with my initial kind of idea of looking back at that essay was the fact, not that the essay felt remote, but that our moment felt so removed from the language and the ideas and the engagement, in a sense, with the medium. It's cool to describe in 1976. This is a more recent image by Martha Rossler. Here's the other, in a sense, the other side of the coin, or not so much the other side of the coin, but the word or the practice, in a sense, that was meant to operate alongside School's words, which was a set kind of division of labor negotiated between the two at a time, which, in a sense, wasn't entirely held to, but functioned very well. This is an image by Ian Hamilton Finley, which ultimately relates to my own feeling about my position vis-a-vis these ideas and kind of historical practices. As much as I may want to draw around my own kind of work and thought in that moment, even though I kind of came through that moment and was formed by that moment, it's a place I can't get back to. None of us can get back to in a way. And so I'm left trying to make something, not in a way out of the past, but out of the bad new times, or the bad new practices, or the bad new ideas in circulation. Another area that I think is interesting that might be worthwhile kind of exploring in discussion is the monopoly on documentary practices that television has kind of wrestled away from other forms of media, print media. This is an image from An American Family, a long televisual, one of the first televisual fly on the wall series about in the States in 1973. Gladiators, a newer piece by Rossler from 2004, which revisits an earlier body of work which wasn't made significantly for an art context, bringing the war home, House Beautiful, but images that were made and which circulated following her intentions in anti-war publications on the West Coast. Now that historical production, of course, was kind of viewed as kind of unexplored kind of gold mine by the art and gallery world, and was ultimately seen and shown within a gallery context. Even if Rossler kind of retains possession of the original works, which have yet to be sold, even though there was kind of interest out of a number of institutions. Now these newer pieces are made and set and intended to circulate through the would-be official channels of the art world and art magazines, which in my mind says something to me both about the status of politics in contemporary art, or the political contemporary art, which is a bit of a double-edged kind of sword, in that if politics becomes fashionable, or fashionable fodder for the art magazines and art galleries, does that mean that the politics that might be in the work, or the political edge of the work, might be somewhat denuded? But it also says something about a kind of pragmatic reading of our contemporary moment, that these images may, in fact, have greater power, greater efficacy if they circulate within the visual, or the kind of sphere of our culture, which is actively making things visible and consumable. I think I'll wrap it up there and kind of launch into, if we can, discussion without much of a hesitation. I'm sorry that my comments were largely kind of provisional and unkempt, but they were changing, and they have been changing much through the day, kind of listening to what's been said. I mean, in conclusion, I think we might reflect on the fact that documentary practices are by necessity historical practices, and therefore they're given to change, or they're defined by the changes in the practices. But that in a sense, what remains a common feature throughout documentary, or a practice which can be called documentary, is that it is fundamentally a social practice. And so that it has inscribed in it this kind of forward intention of circulating in the world in a kind of active way, not simply as art, or not simply only as art, or simply only as image, which is something we should all kind of return to from time to time. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. What we're going to do now is invite Ian Walker to chair up a question and answer session. I'm going to invite all the speakers up onto the platform. I wanted to emphasise that this really is an opportunity for questions from the floor, and perhaps the people on the platform could refrain from having conversation with one another so much. Just because I don't want anybody in the audience to be intimidated that so many people are up on the platform. So if everyone would like to take a seat, if we could raise the house lights to have some slightly more kind of democratic feel to the auditorium, that would be great.
I think they want quite loud mics, so as long as we get them in, it's the safest.
For what?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there was some question as to whether I was going to summarise or not, and I'm not. It would be completely impossible because it's been a very, very rich day, and like the way that John ended, really, my feeling is also provisional and we can change it to the day and carry on changing, I think. But so really, I think we might turn this into a question and answer session. But while you're gathering your thoughts, I would just like to tell you a little bit more about Saint, the cat. Who Connie very kindly mentioned, our dear departed cat. And just to amplify the story that Connie told about showing Sadie's drawing, the drawing that Sadie had made as she was jumping in and out of the window, showing it at the Serpentine Gallery. And two parts of the story, both of which are relevant, believe me. I could talk about this cat for a long time. The first story which Connie, I think, will confirm was apparently that we heard that a couple of curators from the Tate had come round to the Serpentine. They were intrigued by this drawing, but it didn't actually say it was made by the cat on it. It just said it was made by Sadie. And they were fascinated by it, and I think they were almost interested in buying it until they discovered it was made by a cat. That point they lost interest. It's just boring, really. Very catty. But as Connie said, I think that also has something to do with photography. That's work made by an anonymous artist, work made by a cat, work made by photography. It was until not very long ago something that the Tate was not really interested and still have, I think, problems with certain sorts of photography. It has to be certain sort of validated art documentary or documentary art photography. The second thing I'll say is that they didn't buy that drawing. It's still hanging in Newport, but it's hanging right next to the window where it was actually made. And so the relationship to the actual place, the actual situation, and the image, if you like, is also something that reminds me all the time of photography. And it reminds me a lot. I'm very interested in the whole idea of rephotographing, what happens when you go back to somewhere that you know for a photograph, and how does that change the place. And I think the same drawing also does that. But we also have the ashes in the urn, like the back of the But that's enough about Sadie. Anyway, do you have any questions? We have microphones again, so up there, please.
Hello. I'm interested to ask a question of John. You used the word consume when you were talking about Martha Rosler's last image. And you seem to be suggesting, as far as I can tell, that it may be more powerful to encounter the image of the military in the visual realm of an art gallery. And as you were saying that, I began to think that for me the process of consuming is precisely not taking notice of something. We kind of take it on board, it's familiar, and maybe digested or not, but without much attention. And it possibly is much more powerful to encounter that kind of work in places where we do not expect to see it, precisely because it cannot be digested easily.
Yeah. I would disagree because I have a slightly different, or I've come to a slightly different understanding of consumption, which is that consumption is anything but passive. And it can be highly productive, so that consumption isn't solely a kind of a draining or an unreflective activity. The other aspect, which I would kind of use within thinking of that kind of situation, is that if anything, because the image today presses so closely and heavily on all of us, and that the image, in my mind, is exactly the site where so much is at stake and so much is, in fact, being enacted on us. what we really lack today is some degree of critical distance in order to even see those images, or to see the image presented through the world properly. And maybe showing work like that news series of Bring the War Home in 2004 in a context that might, where it might be open to a little bit of critical distance, not simply as the kind of total flow of media images, or even the total flow of those kind of oppositional practices where we might expect them to be. The way, I mean, my eyes, in some way, they glaze over now when I read Red Pepper or what have you, even though I get it, or I subscribe to it. But I'm simply, I was trying, or I'm still trying, in a way to understand Rossler's intentions and attitude in putting forward that work as operating, as being designed to operate within a gallery kind of context, or what she would refer to as the kind of the art nexus, museum, magazine, and gallery, all kind of linked and lubricated by money. And it returns me in a way to thinking her Bowery, the Bowery piece, which was a piece, the only piece at the time, in 74, 75, which Rossler had made that was designed for a gallery, and ideally was made to go into a museum, which at that point in time, there was no hope of it being in a museum. But at least it was designed and made for a gallery. And that piece, the Bowery, was directly in conversation with those documentary practices, which were being taken up by the kind of official modernist museum, gallery, institutional structure. And so I'm trying to think the news series within the context of her practice.
You want to come back on that, Stephen?
What you haven't said, but what I can hear in what you're saying is that one wondered what alternatives Martha Rossler might have chosen as a kind of distribution mechanism for this new work, other than the gallery, and that just is left as a question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, she might have followed the strategy of many other contemporary practices to make it available on the internet. Now, I don't know exactly what Martha would say about the internet, but I mean, certainly I think it would be fair to say that that she might not buy into the kind of false would-be utopian promise of a kind of digital realm of freedom. That the internet is exactly the point at which control and monitoring of all our activities is in a way taking place. No, it's a shrug. It's the shrug kind of.
Any other questions? Chris?
Observation for Steffi in relation to Poundbury. Seems to me there's a lot of discussion about spaces that are dehumanised and how that provides a platform or a stage for a certain kind of ambiance and way of thinking about places. And I mean, I think there's an ethical dimension in terms of that work which was being touched upon. In a sense, it probably, I mean, I like some of the pictures a lot. Formally, they've got a great pictorialism. But it seems to me it'd be much more difficult if, for instance, you had populated the pictures to actually talk about the same kind of issues that we're talking about. And in a sense, the strategy of, removing people from living spaces, ultimately it's almost like a predetermined answer to the strategy that you're embarking on. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, for me, when I work or like for me it's like that I'm trying the notion we discussed about ambiguity as such of what there is, and for me it's like I'm trying to raise question, and for me it's a very strong form of being detached. I mean, I wasn't interested in this kind of, like I said, the ebbs and the flows of the town as such. I was really interested in that, in the sense of how architecture as such, or the physical presence of the way it's built already, to some extent, can form a way of inhabitation, and the way that these alleys exist the way they do, and they create for me certainly, as a distant viewer and maker, in a way, a sense of claustrophobia automatically, and I didn't want, in that sense, the distraction of any human presence as such, because for me they are very much suggesting human presence. Like I said, it's just, I mean, it is inhabited and so forth and so on. It's just that I don't want to make, I mean, I believe the work suggests that very strongly in that sense of how it is. Does that make sense? But I don't want to make it like that specific standpoint. I've put my foot down.
But it's a paradigm, isn't it, for you, in the sense of how alienating this kind of new architecture can be.
Yeah.
But in that sense, the actual place becomes irrelevant in a sense. The actual location, because it is a paradigm, no longer becomes the issue. It could be, in that sense, it could be anywhere. And I suppose the ethical dimension comes in because, as David pointed out, not everyone in Banbury will subscribe to the idea that this is, an extraordinary place to live, necessarily, but it is a place to live. I mean, people live there, and I'm just wondering about where you, as a maker of images, feels that any place can be used as part of a strategic approach, which is an interesting one, to talking about how architecture has potentially become dehumanized.
Well, in that sense, I mean, I think you just answered that in the sense that I was very interested in using it, as I said before, as an example for something that seems to be very current and surrounding us. And it's just, for me, it was very much an engagement with something, like you said, that can become the voyage into something that is all around us, and that can be found in much more universal settings than just Banbury. And that is something, this notion, like I said, of something that maybe might be at the periphery, where it is really set, it is at the periphery of Dorchester, suddenly becomes the center for an engagement for me into this new form of urban planning. And yes, I could have gone, like the question that was raised before, of course I could have gone to wherever, Berlin, Holland. It's just for me an example, like I work with closely, and a locality that I work with, but they can obviously talk about this beyond that boundary necessarily. If that makes sense. Because I never want to speak just in that sense about Banbury as it was intended, the urban example. For me, I don't see it that way. It's a platform for me to engage with something that is very, very everywhere around us. And like you said, whether it's a good form, yes, people are inhabited, and then I do a lot of interviews with these people, and of course the people who live in Banbury are absolutely delighted to pay a certain amount and live there. And I never ever make a standpoint or try to change people's opinions or whatever. That is not my position, I believe.
Any other questions? Any other speakers? In the middle?
I just thought I might ask a stupid question. To get to, since you're all such learned people with different takes on documentary, I wonder whether you'd each like to nominate a smashing documentary picture for us to go away and look at later, and maybe say why you would recommend it. Each of you.
That was an easy question. David, go on.
I was thinking about
main one is to do with scale. For me, the most extraordinary documentary projects have been large, and it's the old cliche that you get out what you put in, whether it's the photographer, stroke writer, or the viewer. So when I look at the covers of those books that I quickly showed you, it'll take you a dense and long but ultimately rewarding weekend to go through Susan Mercedes' Kurdistan book, or Mitch Epstein's Family Business, or Alan Sakura's Fish Story. But I can guarantee if you give it time, it will be extraordinarily rewarding. You'll learn a lot about photography and you'll learn a lot about the world. And I worry about the quickness of certain, or the expectation of quickness, that the viewer is going to be able to get something quickly. The world is extremely complex. A weekend of your time is not a long period to give up to one photographic project. You have extraordinarily sort of short spans of attention we're often told. Yet people are happy to sit through 3 hours of King Kong. Spending that long on one photographic project would be amazing. The flip side of that is, something that Walter Benjamin always used to talk about, which is a dialectical image. Perhaps there are those brief moments where something condenses into a single image, and the paradoxes and the contradictions of the world may be graspable, if you're lucky, in one frame. John?
And the photo is?
The one that always comes to mind, which I really like using in my teaching, because teachers have to get things done in minutes, is a really fantastic picture by Ouija, taken not the very well known one, taken on Coney Island, with everyone looking at the camera. George Michael writes so much on his album. The one I really like is the one where the boyfriend is being resuscitated by the lifeguards, and his girlfriend, who is kneeling over him, there's a whole crowd around him, the girlfriend is kneeling over him, happens to look up and sees a photographer, and probably unconsciously arranges herself into this perfect portrait pose and smiles. And it actually says a lot about documentary and reportage, the fact that reportage always intrudes on the world and people will turn their attention to it. Our existence as modern citizens is framed by the image, and we don't want it to be. A lot is graspable in that single picture. So that's my long answer and my short one, but I prefer the long one to the long. Anyone else want to volunteer?
Well, it's hard to get away from Diane Arbus as a big influence on me, but I am going to instead talk about Refugee Meteor and his work, the family album of Isabel Fraser, which if you know the work, you can see where I'm coming from with that. Any of the pictures in the family album of Isabel Fraser will be good, but particularly the first picture and the last picture, where the whole structure of this fake family album is his wife Madeline wears a hag mask, and there's always a second person in the photograph, and it could be a member of the family, or it could be a neighbour, or some relationship to family, and this other person is wearing a sort of semi-transparent mask, where they're sort of partly revealed and partly camouflaged by this mask. So you get a sort of a hint of who they are, or their age, but you don't really know who they are. And they're all called Isabel Fraser, because everybody has the same name, so you have this sort of idea of everybody being the same and yet being different because of how he places them within the frame and in relationship to Madeline, his wife. And what I like about the family album, the way it's structured, is the beginning of the work is Meteor himself with his wife, and at the end of the book is them together again, but this time they've actually swapped roles completely, and he's actually wearing her clothes. And he's basically, I think, 6 months away from dying of cancer at this point. He's lost a lot of weight. He's very, emaciated. But it's this sort of this sort of wonderful play with identity and with status or non-status, with all sorts of things within relationships that we all don't really think about, but we know. And he's done it in such a sort of quite macabre in some ways. In the work you can see it's been quite creepy, but there's a sort of a tenderness within the work that is what resonates with me.
Will that do me?
I've got one, but if I tell you too much about it, it'll wreck it. But it's a photograph by August Sander called My Wife in Joy and Sorrow. And I don't want to, it's the title, and you can find it. It's a photograph of Sander's wife shortly after the birth of their two sons, immediately after the birth. But one of the children, one of the babies died during birth, and it's a photograph of Sander's wife, and she has a really compelling kind of look, which you can't entirely account for. And you then drop down and begin to look at the details of the photograph. And one of the babies is a baby, completely viable and healthy. And then the other baby mirrors the look on her face in a way, a kind of uncanny way that you can't immediately put your finger on it. And you go back to the title, and then you go back to the photograph, and you go back to the title, you go back to the photograph. And then you look further in the back of the book, and you then find out what happens. But it's a documentary image, which always fascinates me because it goes back to kind of the image as death mask, as something that has passed, memory, preservation, memorial, but an incredibly powerful image. But it's only one picture. You asked for one picture. I think there are other projects which are more powerful in their totality. If I had to find one image that would show something about documentary practice, but also show the kind of acts of the very human practice that it is at the same time. I think that would be
I think it was last year when the tsunami hit Asia. We were just flooded with images, and there was one image that struck me. I think it was probably because it came from the same coast where I was born and brought up. And it was an image that went around the world of a man holding the lifeless hand of his son who had just been drowned. And I looked at it. It was in one of the papers, and I looked at it, and you just saw the man's face in grief, holding this lifeless hand. And then I read something. After I looked at it, I thought, well, there's the child is there somewhere. He's invisible, but how much power there is in the fact that he is invisible, that he's been cropped off. And then I read about how the photographer had looked at the whole image, which showed both the mother and the drowned child on the ground, on the beach, the mother weeping and the child completely had lost some of his limbs. And how he decided that to take it away, partly out of consideration for the family, but partly because